Hello, photographers. I've spent a lot of time talking about ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, and about the virtues of shooting in manual mode. But there is a middle ground between auto mode and manual mode that gives you control of manual with the benefits of auto. And that middle ground are the priority modes on your camera. The most common priority modes are aperture priority and shutter priority, though some cameras do offer additional options. You put your camera into the priority modes using your mode dial. AV stands for aperture value, although some cameras just have an A on the dial. And then TV stands for time value, meaning shutter priority mode, though some cameras just use an S to indicate shutter priority. What's great about the priority modes is that they allow you to pick the setting that you want to control while letting the camera take care of the rest of the settings for you. Let's say you're shooting in aperture priority mode. In aperture priority, you have control over the aperture and the camera has control over the shutter speed, and anytime you change the aperture, the camera will automatically change the shutter speed to keep the exposure indicator balanced out to 0 for a proper exposure. If you were in shutter priority mode, then you would control the shutter speed and the camera would control the aperture, and anytime you changed the shutter speed, the camera would then change the aperture to balance the exposure back to 0. The priority modes are great because they allow you to quickly adjust your settings without having to worry about your exposure. Now, if the priority modes always balance the exposure to 0, you might be wondering how you would over or underexpose your image if you didn't want a perfect exposure. And that's where this button comes in. This is the exposure compensation button. If you have a DSLR with one control dial, like a Canon Rebel series camera or a Nikon D3000 or 5000 series camera, you've already been using this button to change your aperture when you shoot in manual mode. Regardless of whether you have one or two control dials, when in a priority mode, this button allows you to tell the camera that you want to over or underexpose your images. What you do is hold down this button and spin your control dial. When you do that, you'll notice that the pointer on your exposure indicator will start moving. All you have to do is put that pointer where you want your exposure to be. So if you want the image to be overexposed by 1 stop, put the pointer at +1. Or if you wanted it to be underexposed by 2 stops, you put the pointer at -2. Once you've set your exposure compensation, the camera will automatically adjust the setting that it has control over to balance the exposure to what you want. And that's really all there is to using the priority modes. They are super easy to use, but there are a few additional things you need to know. First, and most importantly, when you set your exposure compensation, it does not set itself back. This means if you're shooting and you set your exposure compensation to +2 and then you put your camera away, when you pick it up tomorrow, it will still be set to +2. You have to remember to set your exposure compensation back to 0 when you're done shooting. If you don't, I guarantee you will ruin photos by under or overexposing photos that you didn't mean to under or overexpose. So make sure you set your exposure compensation back to 0 every time you finish shooting in a priority mode. Second, you still have control over your ISO. With priority modes, you actually have control over 2 settings, the ISO and the priority setting of the mode you choose. Priority modes first came around with film cameras where your ISO was fixed when you loaded the roll of film. With digital cameras, you can change your ISO anytime, which actually gives you more flexibility, but that does mean that you have to remember to set your ISO when you're shooting in your priority modes. To do that, just set your ISO based on the lighting conditions that you're shooting in before you actually start shooting. You can always go back and change your ISO later if you need to, which brings us to point 3, and that is that your camera still has limitations. Let's say you're shooting a basketball game in a gym using shutter priority mode and that your lens has a maximum aperture of f6.3. Now let's say you set your shutter speed to 1/1000th of a second to freeze that basketball action, expecting that the camera will take care of the aperture for you, but when you take the photo, it turns out black. Or maybe the camera doesn't even take the photo. The photo is black or it won't shoot because the lens's largest aperture is f6.3, and in that situation, with the shutter speed at 1/1000th of a second, the camera can't open the aperture far enough to let in enough light for the photo. At 1/1000th of a second, you might need an aperture of f1.8 to get a 0 exposure, but the camera can only open up the lens to that f6.3 aperture. This means you can't just go setting your priority settings all willy-nilly. Instead, you have to pay attention to your camera because it will communicate to you when it can't balance the exposure. How the camera communicates this varies, but every camera will give you some kind of indication that you've set your priority setting outside of the limitations of the camera for that situation. When this happens, if you have room, you can increase your ISO, but whether you can change your ISO or not, you have to pay attention to what the camera is telling you. And it's not just for underexposed images. Another example would be setting your aperture to something like f1.8 on a super bright day. In a case like that, the camera may not be able to set a fast enough shutter speed for a decent exposure. So when should you use priority modes? Aperture priority is great for general shooting where you want to control depth of field. This can include street photography, nature and landscape photography, still life photography, portrait photography, and much more. And shutter priority is great when you need to control the appearance of motion in your photos and you have to quickly adjust to moving subjects. This can include all sports photography, wildlife photography, photos of your kids, racing photos, really anything with a moving subject. And truthfully, priority modes can be used in just about any shooting situation that you want. The key is just understanding how they work. Where you don't want to use priority modes is when shooting flash photography. Many photographers get comfortable shooting in priority modes, then get to a point where they want to add flash for shooting in low light situations. They want the flash so that they continue to shoot faster shutter speeds with lower ISOs and still get decently exposed photos. So what happens is they buy a flash and throw it on the camera while shooting in a priority mode, thinking that the camera will automatically adjust the settings for the flash. It doesn't actually work that way. Now, this is a topic for another video, but it is important that you understand that it's more complicated than just putting a flash on the camera and firing away. Now, I've put together a priority mode cheat sheet that covers how the priority modes work and what situations to use them in, and you can get that free guide at this link right here. And if you have any questions about the priority modes on your camera or photography in general, let me know down in the comments. And then do me a favor, would you like this video and subscribe to my channel? If you really like this video, please share it with your friends. I really appreciate the sharing that you guys do. But the most important thing that you need to do is get out there and shoot some damn photos in whatever mode you want. I'll see you guys tomorrow for the live show. Daddy's in the middle of recording. I know. You want to be the star of the show, don't you? Thank you for watching. Now, I get loads of questions and they all boil down to one thing, which is how do I make my camera do what I want it to do? And here's the thing, your camera is like an instrument, and you can't make music if you can't play your instrument. If you want to learn how to play your camera like the instrument it is, visit this link right here to check out my Guide to Shooting in Manual Mode video course.